Hardtack and Coffee, A Soldier's Life in the Civil War is a classic memoir written by John D. Billings, first published in 1887. This engaging account provides a vivid and often humorous look into the daily lives of Union soldiers during the American Civil War. If you enjoy this type of content, please like and subscribe. These are Billings' words. Let's begin. The sketch in this chapter is an attempt to provide a better understanding of the medical department of the Army, what it was, how it developed, and what it accomplished. Although this is only a brief account, it aims to highlight the remarkable contributions of this department, which are often overlooked in the history of the Civil War. While the scope of this chapter necessitates some brevity, I hope it will give due credit to a subject that deserves more attention. At the time of the Battle of Bull Run, there was no organized system for caring for the wounded. Before the battle, while troops were stationed around Washington, general hospitals were established to care for the sick. Hotels, seminaries, and infirmaries in Washington, Georgetown, and Alexandria were repurposed for this purpose. These facilities represented the entirety of hospital accommodations in the first 3 months of the war. So strong was the belief that the war would end quickly that no one considered constructing permanent hospitals. This situation began to change as preparations for a larger-scale conflict took shape. Under General McClellan's leadership, the Army of the Potomac started to take form. On August 12, 1861, McClellan appointed Surgeon Charles S. Tripler as the medical director of the Army. This appointment reflected the intention to build a more structured and comprehensive medical department. Challenges in initial organization. Tripler faced enormous challenges. Army regulations, written long before such a massive conflict was anticipated, were inadequate for the scale of the war. For example, they only provided for 2 types of hospitals: regimental hospitals, specific to individual regiments, and general hospitals, which accepted patients from any regiment. In the absence of a proper system, soldiers could move freely between general hospitals or desert altogether. To address these issues, new measures were implemented. On May 25, 1861, the War Department directed state governors to appoint a surgeon and an assistant surgeon for each regiment. However, many of these appointees were inexperienced country physicians unfamiliar with the demands of battlefield medicine. To improve efficiency and simplify operations, brigade hospitals were introduced in early 1862. These hospitals served multiple regiments within a brigade and were overseen by brigade surgeons with the rank of major. Field hospitals and medical tents. Regimental hospitals were often located in tents, barns, or nearby houses. Brigade hospitals were established to supplement these facilities. Hospital tents became a crucial part of the medical department. Initially, these tents were large, measuring 24 feet by 14 feet. However, their size made them cumbersome to transport and pitch, especially in windy conditions. By 1860, their dimensions were reduced to 14 feet by 14.5 feet, with a center height of 11 feet and a fly for additional cover. Each tent could comfortably house 6 to 8 patients. In colder weather, hospital tents were heated using what was known as the California Plan. This involved digging a pit outside the tent's entrance and connecting it to a trench that ran through the tent. The trench ended in a chimney made of barrels or bricks. Iron plates covered the trench, radiating heat to keep the tent warm. Dr. B.J.D. Irwin of the Army of the Ohio is credited with organizing the first field hospital in tents during the Battle of Shiloh. He repurposed abandoned tents from Prentiss' captured division, laying them out systematically. This innovative approach demonstrated that patients treated under canvas recovered more quickly than those in permanent hospitals. General hospitals and ambulances. As the war progressed, the government began constructing permanent general hospitals to accommodate the growing number of sick and wounded soldiers. By the end of the war, 205 such facilities had been built. Before the Civil War, the Army lacked proper ambulances for transporting the wounded. 2 experimental designs, a 2-wheeled and a 4-wheeled ambulance, had been tested, with the 2-wheeled version initially favored. However, experience showed that the 4-wheeled model was far superior, especially for transporting severely injured patients. When Tripler assumed his role, ambulances were often misused for personal transportation by officers. To combat this, orders were issued restricting their use to medical purposes only, with penalties for violations. The Letterman system. The most significant advancements in the medical department occurred under Dr. Jonathan Letterman, who became medical director of the Army of the Potomac on June 19, 1862. He assumed this role during the chaotic Peninsular Campaign, which revealed severe deficiencies in medical supplies and organization. Recognizing the need for a structured ambulance system, Letterman developed a plan that was approved by McClellan on August 2, 1862. Under Letterman's system, all ambulances within an Army Corps were placed under the control of the Corps Medical Director. A captain served as the commandant of the ambulance corps, with first lieutenants overseeing divisions, second lieutenants managing brigades, and sergeants assigned to regiments. Each ambulance was staffed by 3 privates, including a driver. In addition to ambulances, each corps had 1 medicine wagon and 1 army wagon per brigade. These wagons carried essential medical supplies, including medications, dressings, instruments, bedding, and small items like tumblers, basins, and spoons. Each ambulance was also equipped with a locked box beneath the driver's seat, containing 3 bed sacks, 6 2-pound cans of beef stock, a leather bucket, 3 camp kettles, assorted sizes of lantern and candle, 6 tin plates, 6 spoons, and 6 tin tumblers. 10 pounds of hardtack, added before battles. This system remained largely unchanged throughout the war and became a model for future military medical organizations. Dr. Letterman conceived and executed another important plan, the establishment of field hospitals. The goal was to ensure the wounded received prompt and efficient care during and after engagements, with necessary operations performed by the most skilled surgeons as soon as possible. Under Surgeon Tripler, rendezvous points had been set up behind the Army to treat the wounded before sending them to general hospitals, but this system lacked proper organization and efficiency. Before a battle, a field hospital was established for each division by pitching a suitable number of hospital tents. The medical director of the corps chose the hospital's location, ensuring it was in the rear of the division, out of danger, and easily accessible by ambulances. A division hospital operated under the supervision of a surgeon selected by the division's surgeon-in-chief. This surgeon was assisted by another appointed surgeon responsible for setting up tents, gathering straw, fuel, and water, and making other preparations for the comfort of the wounded. Hospital stewards and nurses from the division were placed under his charge, along with additional personnel detailed from regiments to help. A kitchen or cook tent was quickly erected, and cooks used supplies from ambulance boxes and hospital wagons to prepare nourishing food for immediate use. Another assistant surgeon kept detailed records of patients, noting names, ranks, regiments, types of wounds, treatments, and outcomes. This surgeon was also responsible for ensuring proper burial of the deceased, with marked headboards placed at their graves. Each division hospital had 3 surgeons chosen from the entire division, selected not by rank but for their prudence, judgment, and skill. They performed all significant operations or oversaw their performance. 3 additional medical officers assisted them, while all remaining division surgeons, except 1 per regiment, were required to report to the hospital to dress wounds and assist as needed. Nurses and attendants were also assigned to provide further care. The regimental surgeons stayed in the rear of their respective units during battles, positioned safely to provide temporary aid to the wounded. While field hospitals were intended to be located out of harm's way, this was not always possible. If the tide of battle turned and the Army was forced to retreat, what had been a safe location could quickly become dangerous. Hospitals could not be dismantled or patients evacuated quickly, so medical directors were tasked with selecting medical officers to stay behind and care for the wounded if a retreat became necessary. When such hospitals were captured, it was common practice for the enemy to parole the wounded, requiring them to pledge not to bear arms until officially exchanged as prisoners of war. The U.S. government established parole camps where such individuals stayed until their exchange was finalized. The establishment of field hospitals revolutionized the care of the wounded. Their systematic operation, under strict supervision, saved hundreds of lives. A skilled and energetic medical director ensured that corps-level medical directors supervised division surgeons, who, in turn, held other medical staff and ambulance officers accountable. This well-organized structure ensured the medical department functioned effectively throughout the war. I vividly remember my first experience at a field hospital. It was November 27, 1863, during the Mine Run Campaign. General French's Third Corps was fighting at Locust Grove, and General Warren's Second Corps had also engaged the enemy, driving them from the area near Robertson's Tavern, where, months later, the Battle of the Wilderness would begin. The field hospital for Warren's 2nd Division was set up near the tavern. From where my battery waited in park for orders, I peered inside. The scene was unforgettable. A surgeon had just completed an arm amputation about 5 inches below the shoulder. The stump was carefully dressed and bandaged. As the patient regained consciousness, attendants raised him to a sitting position on the operating table. He turned to look at his arm and, seeing only the stump, fainted. Many soldiers awoke on the operating table to the devastating realization that a limb had been lost, despite their desperate pleas to save it. At Peachtree Creek, Colonel Thomas Reynolds of the Western Army was shot in the leg. While surgeons debated whether to amputate, the Irish-born colonel humorously pleaded, "Spare it. It's an imported leg." His wit saved his leg, though he became a cripple and had to leave the service. Critics claimed surgeons amputated unnecessarily, sometimes for flesh wounds instead of fractures, to save time or for professional pride. While some accusations were likely true, many wounds left no choice but amputation. A soldier in my company lost his arm to what he believed was an unnecessary amputation, a belief he carried for the rest of his life. A corporal in the 1st Massachusetts Heavy Artillery suffered a compound knee fracture at Hatcher's Run on October 27, 1864. At Lincoln Hospital in Washington, a surgeon decided to amputate his leg. Determined to keep it, the corporal obtained a loaded revolver from a wounded cavalryman and hid it under his pillow. When the surgeon returned with stretcher-bearers, the corporal drew the weapon, declaring, "The man who touches me dies." Unable to convince him, the surgeons decided to try a water treatment instead, and the leg was eventually saved. In the hospital, one man lay with a knee wound while another sat nearby, wounded in the finger, a suspicious injury often associated with self-inflicted wounds to avoid combat. 3 wounded Confederate soldiers waited their turn, as Union soldiers were treated first. Nearby, several soldiers lay lifeless or faint from blood loss. Graves with marked headboards were visible just outside the tent. Among the dead was Lieutenant Colonel Theodore Hesser, killed while leading the 72nd Pennsylvania Infantry in a charge. The drizzling rain and somber scene made my first visit to a field hospital one I would never forget. The regulation stating that only members of the ambulance corps or proper medical officers should escort the sick and wounded to the rear was rarely enforced. In practice, many wounded soldiers were helped off the battlefield by comrades who were not members of the corps. During chaotic battles, some soldiers would eagerly take the opportunity to leave the front lines under the pretext of aiding the wounded, often resulting in larger bodyguards than necessary for a single injured man. Many of these escorts conveniently lost their way and did not rejoin their regiments until the battle was over. Among these were the so-called shirks and beats who sought any excuse to avoid combat. However, in fairness, there were also genuinely helpful comrades who lent a shoulder to severely wounded men who could still hobble along. Members of the ambulance corps were easily recognized by their distinguishing green bands. Sergeants wore an 1.25-inch wide band around their caps and inverted green chevrons above the elbows on each arm. Privates also had a green cap band but wore a half chevron instead. These identifiers ensured their visibility during battle and in camp. General Meade's orders in August 1863 allocated ambulances according to the type of regiment, 3 ambulances per infantry regiment, 2 for cavalry regiments, and 1 for artillery batteries. These ambulances remained permanently assigned to their respective units. Artillery companies were responsible for providing their own stretcher-bearers when needed. The role of a stretcher-bearer was demanding and perilous. A personal anecdote from the Battle of Hatcher's Run highlights the trials they faced. After the guns were positioned near Burgess Tavern, a flank attack by the enemy temporarily severed communications with the rear, creating chaos. Amid this, a sergeant requested assistance in evacuating a severely wounded lieutenant lying in a nearby barn. With the ambulance and stretchers out of reach, the only available solution was an abandoned army blanket. The lieutenant, placed on the makeshift stretcher, was in excruciating pain, begging to be left behind. As luck would have it, they found a proper stretcher abandoned by stretcher-bearers who had fled during the enemy's attack. They carefully transferred the lieutenant onto the stretcher and began their retreat. However, enemy sharpshooters opened fire, forcing them into the woods. Navigating through dense forest and growing darkness was a grueling task, but after over an hour of struggle, they successfully delivered their wounded comrade to the ambulance. This experience reflects the many challenges faced by stretcher-bearers, especially during active combat. Severely wounded soldiers often had slim chances of being evacuated from the battlefield as stretcher-bearers were scarce and constantly under fire. Once treated at field hospitals, patients were transported to general hospitals where they could receive better care. These hospitals were strategically located, and whenever possible, patients were transported by specially equipped steamers or hospital trains. The National Museum in Washington even displays models of these steamers and trains, showcasing their design for maximum comfort and efficiency. One invention for battlefield transport was the mule litter or cacolet. These contraptions, strapped to mules or horses, could carry 1 or 2 wounded soldiers. While initially seen as a promising solution, their practicality was undermined by the discomfort they caused. The tight straps and the animal's every motion made them unbearable for severely injured soldiers, leading to their limited use. Despite the advancements in medical logistics, dissatisfaction with the treatment of wounded soldiers persisted. Dr. Henry I. Bowditch, whose son was mortally wounded at Kelly's Ford, voiced this frustration in his plea for an ambulance system. In 1863, Congress debated a bill to establish a comprehensive ambulance corps and improve military hospital organization. Although the House passed the bill, the Senate, led by Senator Henry Wilson, deemed it impractical. The proposal was ultimately shelved, leaving the medical department to function within its existing limitations. The government allocated $42 per year to clothe each private soldier. This budget covered a basic outfit, a cap or hat, usually the former, a blouse, an overcoat, a dress coat, trousers, shirts, drawers, socks, shoes, a woolen blanket, and a rubber blanket. For infantrymen, this was the standard wardrobe. However, many regiments never drew dress coats once they left their home states, with the blouse serving as a substitute. Artillery and cavalry soldiers received similar items, but their outfits included jackets instead of dress coats, boots instead of shoes, and trousers reinforced with an extra layer of cloth from the seat down the insides of the legs for greater durability in the saddle. This initial allowance was rarely sufficient to last an entire year. Soldiers frequently required replacements for various reasons, and the quartermaster provided duplicates when necessary. However, any items drawn beyond the annual allowance were charged to the soldier's account and deducted from their pay. If a soldier managed to stay within the allowance, which was rare, he received the unused balance in cash. Infantry soldiers often discarded clothing during long marches. Burdened with muskets, ammunition, between 40 and 80 rounds depending on circumstances, haversacks stuffed with rations, canteens of water, woolen and rubber blankets, and half-shelter tents, soldiers quickly realized they had to travel light. At the start of a campaign, soldiers often carried more than necessary, but after a few miles, the roadside would be littered with discarded items. Overcoats, dress coats, and other extras were often abandoned, leaving the average soldier with only what he wore. When the Army of the Potomac crossed from Culpeper to Germania Ford during the spring campaign, General Grant observed an immense amount of new blankets and overcoats discarded along the road. He noted this improvidence as a peculiar trait of the Eastern troops. In contrast, Western troops seemed less prone to such wastefulness. Soldiers frequently lost their knapsacks during charges or retreats. In the chaos of battle, they discarded anything that hindered mobility, except for muskets and ammunition. Recognizing these challenges, the government provided free replacements for items lost in action. Quartermasters were required to certify such losses before issuing new supplies. In garrison duty, clothing requirements were even stricter. Soldiers stationed in forts near Washington, for instance, often received visits from distinguished guests and were expected to maintain impeccable appearances. Their uniforms needed to be pristine and their drill performances flawless. When 24,000 of these heavy artillerymen were sent as reinforcements to the Army of the Potomac in 1864, they arrived in spotless uniforms and well-equipped, though they were inexperienced in active campaigning. As they marched into battle, many discarded their oversized knapsacks, transferring keepsakes to their pockets and abandoning the rest. Knapsacks, haversacks, canteens, and shelter tents were all government property, with commanding officers responsible for them. At the end of a soldier's service, these items were to be returned or properly accounted for. An infamous remark once overheard from a temperamental officer claimed that soldiers were nothing but cattle and should be treated as such. While dismissive of the soldiers, this statement unintentionally underscores the importance of literal cattle in sustaining the army. Fresh beef was a staple of the soldiers' rations. When the demand for meat surged during the war, northern farmers and western graziers increased production. Even rugged New England contributed to the supply. Cattle were shipped by rail and boat in the thousands to various armies. Upon arrival, they were corralled and managed by the commissary department. officers submitted requisitions for the necessary rations, which were then distributed to regiments. During the siege of Petersburg and Richmond, a large cattle corral was established near City Point. On September 16, 1864, Confederate forces under Wade Hampton raided this lightly guarded corral, capturing 2,500 cattle and 400 prisoners. This raid provided a critical supply of fresh meat for the poorly provisioned Confederate Army. Despite the loss, the Union Army was largely unaffected due to the abundance of supplies from the North. When the Army was on the move, its supply of cattle traveled alongside it. Herds were managed by detailed soldiers who acted as butchers and drovers, exempt from other duties. At each halt, cattle were slaughtered, and the meat was distributed to the troops. Butchers often killed the cattle using rifles, with rations issued in time for meals. Rather than driving the cattle along the roads, which were occupied by troops in wagons, the herds traveled alongside, skirting fields and woods. Each herd had a lead steer, trained to carry the drover's equipment and cooking utensils. This lead steer, tame and obedient, was guided by the herdsman on horseback, while others managed the rear. At night, one of the herdsmen would lead the herd on foot, making a gentle hallooing sound that the lead steer faithfully followed. This lead steer was a sagacious animal, trusted to guide the rest of the herd, which in turn trailed obediently. The herdsman's route often passed through dense woods, making the hallooing necessary to prevent the herd from straying. For added safety and convenience, the herds were kept closer to the road at night, benefiting from the light of large campfires kindled by cavalry detachments ahead of the army. These fires were especially frequent in wooded or swampy areas, though even with such aids, navigating underbrush and brambles was often thorny and challenging for the drovers. During the summer, the cattle sustained themselves by grazing on the countryside, but winter brought greater hardships. It was a somber sight to see the herds dwindle as the animals were sacrificed one by one, leaving only a handful. When the numbers dwindled to just a few, the remaining cattle seemed to sense their fate, making the butcher's job more difficult. The lead steer, in particular, would avert his head whenever the rifle was raised, forcing the butcher to act with speed and precision to take him down. Although it might appear that there was one large herd for the entire army, this was not the case. The cattle were divided into smaller herds assigned to divisions and corps. For example, when the army entered the Wilderness Campaign, soldiers carried 3 days' worth of hard bread and meat in their haversacks, with an additional 3 days' meat supply stored in their knapsacks. The fresh meat for these rations traveled with the division herds, while larger corps herds provided additional reserves. At the base of supplies, a general army herd was maintained to replenish the corps herds when needed. During the campaign, an estimated 8,000 to 10,000 cattle crossed the Rapidan with the army. Horses played a vital role in the artillery and cavalry, as mules proved unsuitable for these branches. While mules replaced horses in the wagon trains, 6 mules replacing 4 horses, horses remained indispensable in ambulance trains because of their steadier temperament. Their bravery and conduct under fire set them apart as heroes in their own right. Horses often displayed remarkable composure in battle, far surpassing the behavior of men under similar conditions. While men could comprehend the dangers, horses did not distinguish between friend and foe, sometimes running toward the enemy when hit. Many horses, depending on their temperament and the location of their wounds, endured injuries with stoic resolve. A grazing bullet or a wound to the neck often elicited no more than a momentary start or a head shake, as if brushing off a fly. One of the most striking examples of a horse's endurance occurred during the Battle of Reams Station on August 25, 1864. Rebel sharpshooters targeted the 57 or so limber horses of a Union artillery company, aiming to incapacitate the guns. The horses stood harnessed in teams of 6, presenting easy targets. A dull thud marked the impact of a bullet, and many horses endured their wounds with astonishing calmness. Some collapsed from multiple hits, yet struggled back to their feet only to be struck again. General Hancock himself was dismounted during the battle when his horse was shot in the neck and collapsed. Believed dead, the horse rose a few minutes later, was remounted by the general, and survived the war. Horses demonstrated remarkable resilience. Even when a leg bone was shattered by a bullet, a horse might stand on 3 legs until another wound ended its suffering. It was heartbreaking to witness a single horse remain standing amidst the bodies of its fallen companions, enduring shot after shot before succumbing. Beyond their physical endurance, horses often showed intelligence and loyalty. In the cavalry, they recognized their positions in formation and would return to their place even without a rider. Horses turned out to die sometimes tried to join passing columns, hobbling along in their misery to avoid being left behind. A notable example of horse intelligence was Captain W.S. Davis's horse, which had the peculiar habit of sitting on its haunches like a dog whenever the captain dismounted. After being lost for months, the horse was recognized by its distinctive posture against the horizon and eventually returned to its owner. That concludes the 10th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.